Under the blazing sun, a small dehydrated boy staggered across the endless expanse of desert, his tiny frame barely casting a shadow on the scorching sand. Hours from the nearest settlement, his strength was fading fast, until a shadow fell over him. Not one, but many. A pride of lions had found him, and what they did next would defy every instinct you think you know about the wild. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a rolling sea of sand shimmering under the punishing heat. Every gust of wind lifted grains that stung the skin and blurred the horizon. Somewhere in this hostile wilderness, a boy no older than 8 stumbled forward, his lips cracked, his eyes half closed. He had been walking for hours, maybe longer, but time had dissolved into a haze of thirst and exhaustion. His name was Daniel. He didn't remember exactly how he had ended up here. The morning had begun with a family drive through the desert roads. There had been laughter, music on the radio, the promise of reaching a small village where his relatives lived. But then, an accident. A tire blowout, the car swerving violently. In the chaos, Daniel had been thrown from the back seat, tumbling down a sandy slope. When he came to his senses, the car was gone. Only tire tracks remained, and the vast, silent desert. Daniel had followed the tracks at first, but the wind erased them. The sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down like an invisible weight. He tried calling out, but his voice was hoarse, his throat raw. He thought of his mother's face, her warm hands, the way she always told him to never stray too far. He wished he'd listened. By midday, the horizon rippled with mirages. His steps grew uneven. The canteen he had clutched from the wreck was empty. Daniel's mind wandered, teetering between fear and an eerie calm. He didn't see the first lion until it was only a dozen meters away. The animal stood perfectly still, its golden fur catching the sunlight. Then another emerged from behind a dune, and another. Within moments, he was surrounded, a full pride, their amber eyes fixed on him. Daniel's heart pounded. He remembered the documentaries he had seen, the warnings his father had given. Lions are hunters. Don't ever let them get close. Yet none of them moved to attack. The largest lioness stepped forward, her massive paws sinking into the sand, her gaze steady but not hostile. She lowered her head, sniffed the air, and let out a low rumble. Not the roar of a predator, but something deeper, almost questioning. Daniel stood frozen, unsure if this was the moment his story ended, or took a turn no one would ever believe. Under the unrelenting rays of the sun, the lioness maintained her posture, her tawny body radiating brilliance. His legs were shaking under him as he took rapid, short breaths, and his chest, which was relatively small, rose and fell. The heat was pressing on his skin, but the presence of the animals made him feel even heavier. It was as if the air itself was keeping him in place. In a rough circle, the rest of the pride spread out around her as they surrounded her. A total of at least 8 lions were present, including 3 fully grown males with thick dark manes, several lionesses, and 2 younger cubs who looked at the unusual, upright creature that was in front of them with a puzzled expression on their faces. They moved slowly and deliberately, which is the manner that predators evaluate situations without being in a hurry. There was nowhere for Daniel to go, despite the fact that his instincts were screaming at him to go. Every single way was the same. There was nothing but sand dunes, no water, and no cover. If he ran away, he was aware that they could catch him in a matter of seconds. The advice that his father had given him often came back to him. When you are afraid, stay still. Think before you move. There was a tiny breeze blowing, and the golden mane of the largest male stood slightly away from the other members of the congregation. All of his amber eyes were fixed on Daniel's, and they did not budge. Never before had the young lad been in such close proximity to such a beast. The sheer size of the lion was astounding. His shoulders were nearly so tall that they reached his chest, and his hide was vibrating with muscle. He took a step closer to the lioness that was in front of him. The rapid beating of Daniel's heart was so loud that he believed she could hear it. So that her nose was only a few inches away from his shirt, she dropped her head. Her breath had a smell that was reminiscent of meat and the sun, and it was warm. She merely observed him for a considerable amount of time, her whiskers lightly brushing against his arm. Following that, an unanticipated event took place. She went around him and moved past him, positioning her body in such a way that it provided a barrier between him and the rest of the pride. Even when one of the younger boys took a step forward, she let out a low growl that was both harsh and low, which caused him to stop. Daniel blinked his eyes in bewilderment. Is she being protective of him? Minutes seemed to drag on for hours. The sense of pride did not fade away. Instead of moving independently, they started moving together. Their speed was slow but deliberate. The lioness gave Daniel a forceful and persistent prod with her head, nudging him on the side. While he was uncertain about whether or not to put up a fight, he staggered forward, but her glare left no space for debate. He was being directed by her. They made their way up the slope of a dune, with Daniel's sneakers easily sliding through the sand. The wind was stronger at the peak, and he saw the terrain drop into a small basin, where a few hardy bushes were clinging to life like they were trying to survive. There was a bit of shade that was cast by a rock outcrop in the middle of the area. A stealthy escort was provided by the rest of the pride as they followed the lioness as she took him directly to the destination. As the cooler air washed over Daniel, he sank into the shadows, feeling a sense of relaxation flood over him. As he attempted to maintain a regular breathing rate, his hands began to shake as he pressed them to the sand. The lions arranged themselves in a loose ring around him, covering him with their bodies to provide a shield against the open desert. Daniel came to the realization that he was not merely in their domain, rather, he was within their own protection. But terror continued to cling to him. That they had not assaulted him was a mystery to him, as was the reason that they had brought him here. His thoughts conceived of every conceivable scenario. Perhaps they were reserving him for a later time, or perhaps they were simply interested. However, as the cubs approached him, he noticed that they were not showing any signs of hostility in their eyes as they tentatively pawed at his shoelaces. The lioness made herself comfortable close to him, putting her head on her paws. The sun moved slowly across the beach, and the light steadily varied as it did so. The ruffle of the wind and the quiet puff of the lion's breathing were the only sounds that could be heard during the hours that passed in a peculiar silence. At the same time that Daniel's thirst was eating away at him, and his exhaustion was dragging his limbs down, the dread had subsided into something else, something that was more like to amazement. It wasn't until the horizon began to shimmer with movement that he knew they were no longer by themselves. There was a figure that appeared in the distance, and it was moving steadily in the direction of the basin. In the beginning, Daniel was under the impression that it was a mirage. However, as the figure approached him, he realized that it was a guy. He was tall, dressed in a light desert cloak, and he was carrying a satchel across his chest. Although all of the lions raised their heads at the same time, none of them moved to attack. The man's pace did not waver as he neared, giving the impression that he had anticipated discovering them in this location. Daniel felt his heartbeat speed. Who was this individual? What was the reason that the lions did not consider him as an intruder, but rather as someone they were already familiar with? When the guy arrived at the edge of the loose circle that the pride had formed, his strides were methodical, and his eyes scanned each lion with a sense of familiarity. The sun had been on his face for many years, and as a result his skin had become dark and wrinkled, and his beard had become flecked with grey. When the wind blew through the desert cloak, it revealed a worn leather belt with a little dagger sheathed at his side. The weapon was not for hunting, but rather as a tool for survival during the desert. He came to a halt a few steps away from Daniel and lowered himself into a crouch so that they were at the same eye level. The tone of his voice was soothing, steady and deep, and it carried the cadence of someone who spent more time listening than engaging in conversation. It was in English with an accent that he said, "You've been walking for a very long time. You must be hungry and thirsty." The dryness in Daniel's throat prevented him from uttering a single syllable. The man reached into his satchel and pulled out a little flask made of goatskin. He then held it out to the audience. Daniel paused for a while, casting a glance at the lions who were surrounding him, but the man only waved once more. "They won't cause you any harm. Drink up." When Daniel took his first gulp, his throat burned. And then he was blessed with the refreshing coolness of water. He drank with a voracious appetite, and then he coughed, causing some of the liquid to fall across his chin. A small smile was all that the man did. He did not reprimand him. in a slow manner, "You shouldn't put too much pressure on your body all at once." Daniel's voice was hoarse, despite the fact that he had finally managed to speak. "What are you?" It was the man who responded. "My name is Samir." He gave a little motion in the direction of the lions, who had returned to their previous position, their amber eyes half closed. "I live with them. They are a part of my family." The lines on Daniel's brow moved. "Are you living with lions?" At first, Samir did not respond immediately. Instead of doing so, he extended his hand toward the lioness who had brought Daniel to this location. As if she were a domestic cat welcoming its owner, she lifted her head and pressed it into his palm on several occasions. "Ever since I was a young lad your age, I have been aware of this pride, more times than I can count. They have prevented me from losing my life. Moreover, it would appear that they have rescued yours." The words seemed to be a dream. Daniel cast another glance in the direction of the lioness, recalling how she had positioned herself between him and the other individuals, and how she had led him to the shade. Why would they try to assist me? Samir's eyes became quiet and reflective. There is more to lions' understanding than people realize. Not only do they know weakness, but they also know threat, and they know innocence. They do not perceive you as a threat. Are they of the opinion that you are something that should be protected? The sun started to set in the afternoon, which resulted in the basin being covered in darkness. Despite the fact that Samir gave Daniel a small piece of dry meat, he made sure to give the youngster more than he gave to himself. He kept his voice quiet throughout the entire conversation, delivering small anecdotes about the desert and how to survive in it. He explained how to follow the wind to find water, how to distinguish between plants that were safe to eat and those that were deadly, and how to observe the behavior of animals in order to forecast the weather. Nevertheless, Samir's tone altered when there was a sudden shift in the wind. His body remained motionless as he turned his head in the direction of the north. The similar response was displayed by the lions, their ears pricked forward and their muscles tensed. A low growl could be heard emanating from the lioness's chest as she took a few steps forward. It caused Daniel's tummy to clench. "What is the matter?" Eyes constricted under Samir's gaze. "We are not to be alone. Someone is going to arrive, and it won't be me." From the other side of the ridge, one could make out the faint forms of 3 men going in a staggered line, their pace being very frantic. Despite the fact that they were holding long sticks that glistened softly in the waning light, they were dressed in clothes that did not match. It's firearms, not sticks. In order to provide Daniel with stability, Samir placed his hand on his shoulder. "Do not go away from me. Under no circumstances should you attempt to flee." As they got closer, the men's gaze scanned the basin as they approached. Daniel was unable to understand the language that was being shouted by one of them, and the tone of his voice was sharp. The lions feigned aggression, but did not move forward. With a step forward, Samir placed himself in the middle of the group of strangers and the young child. He yelled out, "Leave!" with a voice that carried the weight of authority. Among the men, the tallest one made a short, sharp sound as he laughed. "Do you have a boy that you have been keeping in your deserty, old man?" It was then that his eyes moved to the pride. "It's also possible that you're concealing something of greater value." Daniel felt a shudder run through his body, but Samir did not quiver in response to the innuendo. "This child has gone missing. You are not going to touch him." The man's grin grew wider as he elevated his weapon to a slightly higher position. "We are free to do anything we choose out here." The lioness took a stride forward, her growl becoming more intense, and the rest of the pride rose to their feet in unison, their voices remaining hushed. It was possible for Daniel to sense the change in the atmosphere, the precarious equilibrium that was on the verge of something hazardous. Suddenly, without any prior notice, one of the strangers moved one step closer than they should have. The largest male lion charged forward at the precise instant that the man's boot made contact with the sand, which was located just beyond the invisible limit of the pride. The sound of his growl, which was a deep and primal sound that seemed to reverberate in Daniel's chest, shattered the calm air of the landscape. The remaining lions joined in, their voices blending together to form a chorus that made it very clear that they would not permit the invaders to go any closer. Rifles tightened in their grasp as the three men came to a complete stop. It was instinctive for the tall one to lift his weapon, but before he could even aim, the lioness raced forward in a whirl of muscle and speed, with her teeth exposed and the sand strewn about beneath her paws. She came to a sudden stop. The meaning of the warning was crystal clear. If she took one more step, she would not show any mercy. Samir moved swiftly, taking a step to the side, protecting Daniel while also positioning himself so that he was within arm's reach of the lioness. He had a commanding voice that was able to pierce through the stress. At this point, you are in their domain. Get away before they decide that you are their target. In an uneasy manner, one of the younger males shuffled over. He whispered to the commander, "We don't need trouble, Arif," as he looked at him. However, Arif's gaze narrowed first on Daniel and then focused on Samir. It is worth a good reward, or much more, to find a lost boy. We are not going to part ways without him. A deeper roar could be heard coming from the pride as their bodies lowered into a predatory stance. In Daniel's ears, his heart was beating rapidly. His feet remained firmly planted in place, despite the fact that every instinct in him yelled at him to conceal himself and vanish. Not only were the lions protecting themselves, but they were also protecting him. Samir, with his hands open at his sides, made a hesitant step forward of his own accord. "Arif, there is no reward that is worth more than your life. Make a U-turn." However, Arif's hunger triumphed over his caution. As he moved the weapon closer to Samir, he tightened his grip on the trigger with his fingertips. All that followed was a haze of confusion. The lioness was the first to move, and a golden fur streak slashed through the gap that separated them. She whacked the weapon with her enormous paw, which caused it to fall into the sand. Arif was unable to respond before the male lion lunged forward with a roar that was so powerful that Daniel could feel it in his bones. It was the other two men that lurched backward, with one of them completely dropping his weapon. Samir yelled something in the native language that was both sharp and forceful, and the lions stopped in the middle of their advance and remained where they were. Not only did they not retreat, but they also did not launch an attack. Daniel could feel the effort in Samir's posture as he kept the predators in check. It was a thin line of control that was fraught with danger. The sun was shining, but Arif's face was pallid as he struggled to get to his feet. He took a quick look at the weapon that was lying in the sand, and then he looked at the lions that were surrounding it. It appeared as though he had come to the conclusion that collecting the rifle would be a suicide mission. He spat out, "This isn't over," before retreating from the situation. His colleagues swiftly followed behind him, casting anxious looks over their shoulders till they disappeared over the rise. It was as soon as they left that the collective strain within the pride began to subside. In a manner that was almost reassuring, the lioness came back to Daniel and gently brushed against him once she had returned. With some reluctance, Daniel extended his hand and his fingers sank into the rough warmth of her fur. Samir let out a slight exhalation, and for the first time, his shoulders began to relax. "For the time being, you are safe." Daniel raised his head and stared up at him, his voice shaking. "You asked, why did they listen to you?" On the other side of him, Samir knelt down and placed his hand on the lioness's shoulder. "Since I have successfully earned their trust, simply put, that is more difficult than surviving in this desert." A bright orange light was spreading across the sand dunes as the sun was rapidly setting. A gaze toward the horizon was given by Samir. "We are unable to remain here tonight. They will return, possibly with a larger number of guys. We had to get moving before the sun goes down." When Daniel looked at the pride, he began to hesitate. "Will they decide to accompany us?" The look in Samir's eyes changed. "There will be some sufficient to guarantee that we will arrive at a secure location." While they were getting ready, the lioness remained close to Daniel, her tail swishing lazily, but her eyes were continuously looking over the ridges where they were standing. As they followed, the cubs trotted around in a fun manner, completely oblivious to the danger that they had just averted. The heat of the day was beginning to give way to the coolness of the evening as they set out in the direction of the west. Alongside them, the lions glided as if they were silent shadows, leaving delicate footprints in the sand that was cooling off. A whirlwind of questions whirled about in Daniel's head, including those concerning Samir, the pride, and the reasons why fate had brought him to this unattainable encounter. On the other hand, one question remained more prominent than the others. In the event that the men came back, would even the bravery of a pride of lions be sufficient to keep him safe? An entirely new kind of peril awaited them in the desert night. As the sun descended below the horizon, the temperature of the air began to drop rapidly. Yet, the darkness carried with it a feeling of vulnerability that caused Daniel's nerves to break. The dunes, which were previously bright and sparkling, transformed into towering shadows, and every gust of wind conveyed whispers that may have been the footsteps of something or someone that was following. The moonlight illuminated the folds of Samir's desert cloak as he moved forward, maintaining a steady pace. In spite of the chilly air, the lioness remained close to Daniel's side, her warmth spreading through the atmosphere. She would occasionally brush against him, as if to remind him that she was still there in the vicinity. With their cushioned steps, the rest of the pride walked behind them in nearly complete stillness. Their footsteps made almost no sound at all. Daniel took a quick look at the night sky. They were hundreds of pinpricks which were dispersed throughout an unending black sky, and they were brighter than anything he had ever seen before. Although it was stunning, it did not alleviate the tightness that was there in his chest. The silhouettes of Arif and his men climbing a dune were something he half expected to see every time he turned around and looked back. Apparently, Samir was able to detect his uneasiness. It was without turning that he made the statement, "You're thinking about you." Daniel took a throatful. It was stated that they will return. It's possible, Samir readily admitted. At night, however, we have an advantage. In the dark, it will be difficult for them to locate us. The amount of wind that was blowing increased, and as it moved across the sand, it erased their footprints as they went. The realization dawned on Daniel that this was the reason Samir had decided to travel at this time. By the morning, no one would know which direction they had gone. Samir directed them in the direction of a jagged outcrop of rock that protruded from the dunes like the spine of some ancient creature. This landmark was located after nearly an hour had passed. At its base, there was a crevice that was so small that it was just barely big enough for a person to pass through. The gesture that Samir made was for Daniel to go first. In this room, immediately, a little secluded hollow was revealed after the passageway was opened up inside. The walls made of stone were able to block the majority of the wind, and there was sufficient space for the youngster and the lions to do some resting. The astringent, dry odor of sand was replaced by the aroma of earth. When Daniel finally collapsed on the ground, he was overcome with tiredness. In a rough semicircle, the pride of lions bedded down, with the lioness selecting the position that was closest to the entrance. Samir got down close by and began searching through his bag, till he came across a small item that was carefully wrapped in cloth. On the inside were slabs of bread and dates that had been dried out. The only thing he said was, "Eat," and he handed them to Daniel. The youngster accepted the food with gratitude and chewed it slowly. "Why do you choose to reside in this location, which is so far away from everyone?" Samir assumed a reclining position against the stone, his eyes partially obscured by the darkness. "Because everyone that doesn't understand them," he continued, cocking his head in the direction of the lions for further emphasis. "People are afraid of things that they are unable to control. They are not my pets, and I am not their master. I am not their master out here. We are the same people." Daniel reflected on the manner in which the pride moved together, with each individual lion being in sync with the others. There was no conflict between lions over food or territory, like in the documentaries that were played out. Unlike anything else, this was something that was established on complete faith. But before he could ask any further questions, the lioness became rigid. Her ears perked up, and she kept her focus set on the entryway, which was somewhat narrow. Instantaneously, the remaining members of the pride responded by raising their heads and tensing their bodies. Listening, Samir remained still. There was a change in the breeze outside, and it brought with it the faint sound of footsteps pressing on sand. Daniel's stomach sank to the floor. "Is it that they—" he murmured subtly. There was a hardening in Samir's expression as he raised his hand to request silence. Without uttering a single word, he proceeded towards the door and squatted down. Following closely behind, the lioness kept her body in close proximity to the earth. A shadow moved over the gap, and at first it was just one shadow, then someone else, and then a third. In the dark light of the moon, the glint of metal was captured. Rifles are used. They were able to locate them. In addition, they were not by themselves this time, as evidenced by the sound of voices traveling on the wind. Because of the shifting wind, the voices that were heard outside were low but urgent. They were transported into the depression. Daniel was able to make out snippets of speech, which included both laughter and harsh demands. Regardless of who they were, they had confidence going in their favor. Turning his attention to him, Samir's speech was barely audible above a breath. "Stay in the rear of me. Do not move unless I tell you to do so." Already crouching at the entrance, the lioness' tail was twitching in short, fast jerks. She was getting ready to attack. Daniel was surrounded by a protective semicircle formed by the other members of the Pride, who had risen in silence. Even the cubs had stopped playing, and their fun nature had been replaced by something more old-fashioned and natural. Suddenly, a sliver of light that was very dim rushed across the tight entrance. It appeared like someone outside was holding a flashlight. As if they had seen something, the beam came to a stop and hovered in the air. A sarcastic voice was heard calling out, "Young man, we are aware that you are present. If you bring the boy out, there is a chance that we will let you live." Nobody responded from Samir. His gaze remained fixed on the entryway, and every muscle in his body tensed up. Increasing in volume, the lioness's snarl reverberated across the confines of the small cell. Another movement of the flashlight beam was followed by the sound of boots rubbing against stone, which indicated that someone was attempting to squeeze through the tight space. Samir made a little movement to the side, and his hand delicately touched the lioness's shoulder as a quiet cue and communication. The head of the invader was the first thing to see, and his gun was tilted somewhat awkwardly in the cramped room. It was just as he was about to fully go inside that the lioness charged forward with a scary intensity. Her howl, which was both primal and terrible, filled the deep pit. Instantaneously, the man retreating so quickly that he dropped his weapon in the process. The shouts came from the outside, "A shoot! Just fire it!" However, the Pride did not charge without any discernible purpose. Rather, they maintained their place, obstructing the entry like an immovable wall. Taking a step forward, Samir's voice could be heard reverberating across the tumult. "Get out of here! This will be your final opportunity." In the midst of the night, a gunshot rang out rather than the party retreating. Within the confines of the room, the noise was nearly inaudible. The stone was struck by a bullet, which caused sparks to fly everywhere. Daniel instinctively ducked, and his heart banged against his ribs as he did so. Together, the lions let forth a roar that was so powerful that it shook the very air. Samir's voice was able to be heard above the din. "Now!" The most gigantic male lion surged through the aperture, thrusting his massive frame into the space between the two platforms. The assailants on the outside erupted in screams and stumbled backward. After that, the lioness followed, and all of a sudden, the darkness outside was filled with the sound of snarls, human yells, and scurrying feet. There were shadows whirling in the moonlight, and Daniel moved forward just enough to see them. It was men abandoning their guns and running away into the sand dunes. One of them fell down the slope and tumbled down the side of the hill, his flashlight falling away from him. They did not pursue the intruders very far, but they were able to drive them back just far enough to make it abundantly evident that the war was ended. In spite of the fact that their movements were calm, the lion's breathing was labored when they returned. Even though her fur was ruffled, the lioness' eyes were bright as she made her way back to Daniel. She carefully tapped him on the shoulder, as if to make sure he was not hurt in any way. Samir snatched up the weapon that had fallen to the ground and hurled it with great force into the darkness of the valley. He said, "They won't risk coming back tonight," but his tone did not convey any sense of satisfaction. Rather, it conveyed just worry. "Mr." Daniel took a deep breath. What if they discover us once more the following day? Samir's eyes wandered toward the horizon, where the first glimmer of dawn was beginning to illuminate the sky. He looked in that direction. "Then we make certain that they are unable to follow us in any way." Daniel did not inquire about the manner, As a result of his interactions with Samir, he had realized that solutions didn't come until they were required. In spite of this, the young man was unable to escape the idea that whatever was to come would put not only their ability to survive to the test, but also the unseen tie that was now connecting him, Samir, and the pride together. At the same time, he was aware that Arif had not given up somewhere in the sand dunes. The man's eyes were still looking for them in the darkness, and he could almost feel them searching for them. By the time the desert was illuminated by the first rays of sunlight of the morning, Samir had already begun making travel preparations. All through the night, the wind had been blowing steadily, and it had swept away the majority of the tracks that were around their shelter. However, he was familiar with men like Arif, who did not give up easily, and had the ability to interpret clues that others failed to notice. His eyes, which were still heavy from exhaustion, were stroked by Daniel. While the lioness was lying down next to him, her breathing was slow and deep. However, as soon as Samir stood up, she opened her eyes and stood up without any hesitation. With fluid and subtle motions, the rest of the pride followed her lead and followed in her footsteps. In the midst of delivering Daniel a piece of flatbread, Samir announced, "We are leaving now. We walk as we eat. In order to avoid the sun reaching its peak, we require some distance." Daniel complied, despite the fact that a nervous energy was causing his gut to twist. His thoughts kept going back to the events that had transpired throughout the night, including the roar of the lions, the flash of the gun, and the shadow of Arif's face on the moon. This entire experience seemed to be a dream, with the exception of the beating of his pulse that occurred when he recalled how close they had been to being trapped. As they marched toward the west, the sun rose higher and higher with each step they took. As if they were sentries conducting a silent patrol, the lions went forward and backward, with some of them arranging themselves off to the sides and inspecting the sand dunes. Daniel remained in close proximity to the lioness, and her golden eyes frequently glanced in his direction. Within her company, he had started to have a peculiar sensation of ease, as if she could detect his thoughts before he even had the chance to think them. Samir made a sharp turn toward a narrow canyon that was concealed between two high mountains after an hour had passed. On the inside, the air was cooler, and the earth was more solid. The rock walls narrowed until they formed a shaded passageway that was just barely broad enough for two persons to walk side by side. This occurred at one particularly sharp turn. Samir whispered, "This is one of my paths," about the situation. "Very few people are aware of it. We shall be able to escape their grasp if we are fortunate enough to travel a sufficient distance." They continued to make their way deeper into the canyon, where the sounds of the open desert gradually became less audible. A bird's call could be heard reverberating off the stone, and it blended in with the sound of the wind rustling in the distance. Daniel started to believe that perhaps they were secure, but then the lioness stopped in the middle of her step. Her ears were twitching. The hill that was above them caught her attention right away. As he followed her line of sight, Samir's jaw muscles became more tense. He issued the following command: "Keep moving, but stay close to the wall." Daniel felt his heartbeat speed. "What exactly is it?" It was Samir who mumbled, "Tracks. The most recent ones. Recently, there has been a visitor here." Immediately before to Daniel's ability to respond, a pebble fell from the ridge and landed on the floor of the canyon. Then someone else. Without making a sound, the remainder of the pride shifted into protective positions, and the muscles of the lioness began to brace themselves. There was a voice that boomed out from above, and it was eerily familiar. "Are you going places, you old man?" Upon raising his gaze, Daniel noticed that Arif was standing on the ridge, surrounded by two other men. The metal of their guns was illuminated by the light of the morning. As a result, Samir did not spend time with words. With a tone that was low and urgent, he uttered, "Run." For a moment, Daniel was divided between obeying and remaining close to the pride. He paused for a short moment. On the other hand, the lioness made the decision for him. She pushed him forward with her head and poked his back as the first gunshot rang out through the canyon. A few inches away from Samir's shoulder, the bullet struck the rock wall, which caused the stone to split and fly into the air. The roars of the lions were synchronized, and the sound of their roars was amplified by the walls of the canyon, transforming the area into a chamber of thunder. Samir moved with the grace and confidence of a guy who was familiar with every nook and cranny of the landscape. More quickly, as Daniel continued to make his way deeper into the winding passage, he yelled out again. With her body positioned low and ready to spring, the lioness remained in the space between the boy and the gunman. However, as they turned a bend in the canyon split in two ways, and additional individuals arrived beginning from the left route. It wasn't only that Arif had followed them, he had sprung a surprise on them. As soon as Daniel noticed the soldiers blocking the left passage, he felt a tightening in his chest. At least 4 of them were present, and each of them was armed. Their shadows stood out strikingly against the brightness of the canyon. As soon as he saw the youngster, one of them gave a grin and raised his weapon as if the outcome of the event had already been completed. Nothing slowed Samir down at all. After a moment of reflection, he looked to the left and then to the right. "On this path," he yelled out as he led Daniel in the direction of the more congested left passageway. The first to move was the lioness, who slipped into the opening with her shoulders just brushing against the stone. Daniel followed, and as the space surrounding him became more congested, he felt the rock scratch against his arm. Behind them, the remaining members of the Pride arranged themselves in such a way that they formed a living barrier. The roars that they made reverberated so loudly that it seemed as though the canyon itself was snarling. The moment was shattered by a gunshot, and the sound ricocheted off the stone until Daniel was unable to determine where it originated from. Due to the impact, sand and dust began to fall from the sky. With lightning speed, Samir grabbed a rock that was about the size of his fist and hurled it against the wall that was located far away. Due to the strong crack, it appeared as though someone had shot their weapon from that particular direction. One of the men yelled out in bewilderment, and the lions moved in to attack during that moment of doubt. The largest male member of the group charged forward, his roar resonating through the cramped area like an explosion. The perpetrators of the attack instinctively retreated, causing them to stumble over each other. The lioness did not completely launch an assault. Rather, she snatched the air only a few inches away from the nearest man's leg, which compelled him to retreat. "Let's go," Samir prodded once more, this time pushing Daniel further into the increasingly congested tunnel. As they moved on, the ground beneath them began to slope lower, leading them to a stretch of rock walls that were positioned so that they blocked the majority of the sunlight. The temperature of the air dropped, but Daniel's skin was tingling with the stress. He murmured, "They're still behind us," as he heard footfall that were faint but persistent through the distance. "I am aware," Samir responded. Despite the fact that his speech was solid, Daniel could not help but notice a hint of calculating in his eyes. "They will continue to follow until we force them to stop." The lioness ambled along, but then she suddenly stopped moving. Her eyes were locked on a shadow that was just around the corner, and her ears began to twitch. Suddenly, she let forth a low growl from her throat. In an effort to touch Daniel's shoulder, Samir extended his hand. "Remain in this location." He moved stealthily forward, vanishing out of sight around the bend. Daniel was only able to pick up on the faint sound of shifting gravel for a little period of time, and then he heard Samir's voice, which was calm yet firm. "It is obvious. Make a move." The reason Samir had halted was revealed to Daniel as he rounded the turn. Overhead, the path extended into a tiny basin that was partially obscured by darkness. An ancient stone edifice stood in the middle of the area, with collapsing walls that were partially covered in sand. It appeared to be the remnants of a watch station that had been abandoned years ago. Quickly, Samir led him in the direction of it. "Let us make advantage of the ruins. In and out, there is just one way, that is where we keep them." Almost immediately, the lions dispersed themselves, as if they had comprehended the strategy. There were 2 males who positioned themselves at the entrance of the basin, their bodies obstructing the entrance that was relatively narrow. Daniel remained with the lioness, her flank rubbed on his leg as she remained with him. After some time had passed, voices and boots came closer once more. A low and mocking laugh emanated from Arif as it floated into the basin. "Old man, you are one of the animals that have been confined." It was a solid response from Samir. "Then you should come and observe how vicious animals can be when they are cornered." A moment after the first guy came into view, the male lions dropped their heads and exposed their teeth, which caused the man to freeze. People did not move for a single heartbeat. Daniel was able to detect the scent of powder in the air as a result of the proximity of the second gunshot that could be heard. At the very top of Samir's skull, the bullet made contact with the stone. Daniel came to the realization that something was happening at that same moment. The lions were roaring so loudly that the ground appeared to shake. If Arif were to make moves at this moment, this would not be merely a struggle for freedom. Rather, it would be a struggle till the very end. The standoff dragged on like a tied bowstring, with each passing second feeling more weighty than the one before it. Arif stood just beyond the entrance to the basin, raising his weapon to a level position while wearing a crooked look on his face. The men who were following him shuffled uncomfortably behind him, their eyes darting to the lions who were blocking the path. Even though Samir's voice was calm, there was a steely quality to it. You do not walk away. Rather, you take a step forward. Daniel was pressed closer too by the lioness, who was stiff throughout her body and had her stare fixated on the intruders. The pounding of Daniel's heart could be heard in his ears. In addition to the continuous, low vibration of her growl, he was able to feel the heat emanating from her flank. Arif stepped into the basin with a single, slow step. "Do you believe that your animals will be able to stop me?" as he put it. Joyce's teeth are absolutely irrelevant to bullets. Eyes constricted under Samir's gaze. In addition, they are not concerned with fear. You have a greater amount of that than you acknowledge to having. The uneasy movement of one of Arif's guys was followed by a glance in the direction of the canyon. "Dear boss, perhaps we—" Arif snarled. "Quiet," his voice as piercing as the wind that blows through the desert. There was no movement from Samir, but the male lions did. They both took a stride forward at the same time, bringing the space between them and Arif down by a few steps that were deliberate. Their enormous heads were lowered, and their muscles were visible through their tawny fur. The sound that they made was more than just a growl. It was a warning that had been retrieved from the depths of their heritage, a sound that spoke of millennia of survival. After a moment of hesitation, Arif tightened his hold on the rifle. The thoughts in Daniel's head were racing. They could not remain in this location indefinitely. Even if Arif retreated, he would still be able to wait them out. The young child cast his gaze in the direction of the back of the basin, where the crumbling stone wall made contact with the shadowy slope. "Samir," he murmured, "is there any other way out of this situation?" Samir's eyes darted back and forth toward the same location. He whispered, "In all likelihood, there is. Sometimes older fortifications have escape routes built within them, but it will be a close call." Daniel's attention was abruptly drawn back to the front of the room as he heard a shout from one of the men. The movement of them. It turned out to be accurate. The lions had started up a methodical and gradual march. Arif and his men were forced to surrender ground with each step they took. However, Arif, who was adamant and refusing to exhibit any signs of weakness, raised his weapon once more. When the gunshot rang out, it was like lightning. Dust erupted from the stone that was located next to the lioness's eyes. She did not flinch. Rather, she pushed forward with such speed that Arif fell backward, causing his shot to miss the target. It was a moment that Samir grasped. "Now!" he yelled out, while pointing in the direction of the back of the basin. Daniel did not waste any time. He ran in the direction of the slope that was obscured by shadows, and the lioness soon flanked him. The sounds of roars, shouts, and the scrape of boots on stone could be heard coming from behind them. A jagged crack in the wall was created as a result of the slope, and it was just barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. Daniel lowered himself to his knees and crawled into the confined space to get closer. After that, the lioness followed, and despite her enormous size, her movements were remarkably quiet. On the other side, Daniel discovered that he was in a ravine that was concealed from view. The floor of the valley was covered with pieces of rock and dried bush. Because of the lack of sunlight, the temperature of the air was lower here. Next to emerge was Samir, who was breathing heavily but steadily. Now he was looking at Daniel. "Proceed, trace the ravine to the north. By doing so, we will be able to escape their grasp." However, before they could change their position, a sound broke through the silence. It was a single voice that was far closer than it should have been. "It is Arif." They had been followed by him, and he wasn't by himself this time around. Before his form emerged from the crack in the wall, Arif's shadow stretched out across the floor of the ravine for a considerable amount of time. The man moved with the calm, deliberate confidence of someone who believed the hunt was almost over. He moved with this certainty. With their rifles ready, two of his men followed closely behind, their eyes sweeping the tight passageway as they did so. Daniel's breath abruptly stopped. Given that the walls of the valley rose steeply and sheer on both sides, there was no place to escape. The lioness took a step forward, positioning herself so that she was directly between the boy and the guys who were moving forward. She kept her head down, and her shoulders rolled with each stride that she took. In spite of its lack of volume, Samir's voice held a tone of caution. The phrase, "You've come far enough, Arif." Arif's eyes took a fleeting glance at the pride that was accumulating around them. "So, this is the place where you will make your final strike." A smile appeared on his face, but it was devoid of any sense of humor. "The boy is going to accompany me. Should you choose to pass away beside your animals, you are free to retain them." On the other side of him, Daniel felt the muscles of the lioness tense, and the vibration of her growl was building up like a storm that was about to arrive. On the contrary, Samir did not immediately respond. Instead, his eyes focused on the landscape. There was a steep bend in the valley just beyond where Arif was standing, and Daniel observed a tangle of loose pebbles clinging to the hillside high above that bend. Samir was also able to see it. Daniel was the only one who could hear his voice as it lowered to a whisper. "You should head toward that bend when I tell you to sprint. Maintain a modest profile." Taking another step forward, Arif raised his gun to a slightly elevated position. "I've had enough of fun, old man." When Samir straightened up, there was a dramatic change in his tone as he said, "You are correct. It is enough." At that moment, the largest male lion moved swiftly, a whirl of tawny muscle erupting toward the men. Arif yelled and then lurched backwards when he fired a wild shot that missed the target. As his soldiers frantically attempted to aim, they walked too close to the bottom of the slope, which caused them to lose their aim. Instantaneously, Samir responded. When he reached down to the ground, he grabbed a stone about the size of his fist and tossed it upward at the collection of loose rocks. The hit caused a tremor to spread across the slope, and then, with a rumbling that was both deep and grinding, the rockfall started. As the rocks and rubble continued to fall, dust began to billow, and Arif and his men were forced to dive and take cover. Not only was the boom loud, but the air was filled with grit. "Hurry!" Samir yelled out. At the same time as Daniel was running toward the curve, the lioness was running ahead to clear the way. Their roars mixed with the fading shouts that were coming from behind them as the remainder of the pride followed behind them. Within a matter of seconds, the ravine abruptly twisted, concealing them from observation. They continued to move forward until the ground started to give way once more, which resulted in a little opening at the opposite end. The sunlight that was shining through it was brilliant and warm. While he was there, Samir paused and listened for any indication of a chase. All that responded was the wind. While Daniel was catching his breath, his chest began to heave. "Do you believe that they will follow up?" Samir continued to fix his gaze on the shadows that were behind them. "They won't do that if they are intelligent." However, Arif, he let the thought to gradually fade away, as if uttering it could make it come true. Daniel's side was lightly touched by the lioness, and her gaze wandered aimlessly throughout the scene. For a fleeting instant, the young kid experienced the immense burden of everything, including the peril, the tiredness, and the peculiar connection that was suddenly connecting him not only to Samir, but also to these wild protectors. As well as this, he was well aware that the battle was not yet over. Arif would be thinking about his next move when he was in the desert, somewhere in the midst of the solitude. Once they had made their way through the small exit, they emerged into a tract of desert that was very different from the open dunes that they had traversed earlier. There were jagged stone outcrops and clumps of tough bushes scattered across the ground here. These shrubs provided just enough shelter for them to remain hidden if they kept their movement low. In spite of the fact that the sun was still soaring, the air was shimmering with heat. While leading the route, Samir's gaze scanned every hill and hollow in the landscape. His voice was soft as he whispered, "We stay close to the rocks. It is more difficult to follow the tracks here." Daniel nodded, despite the fact that the constant strain was causing his legs to hurt. While she remained at his side, the lioness's pace was identical to his, giving the impression that she had made the decision that protecting him was her primary objective. With the pride spreading out in a disorganized pattern, they navigated their way through a labyrinth of stone. Every once in a while, one of the males would pause, take a whiff of the air, and quickly turn their gaze back toward the ravine. There was no need for Samir to express what everyone else was thinking. If Arif was still alive after the rockfall, he would be coming. At the middle of the day, the heat had caused the air to become thick and oppressive. Samir gestured for them to take a break there, after they discovered a shallow overhang that had been cut into the rock above them. The shade was very much appreciated by Daniel, who sank onto the cool stone. Some of the lions positioned themselves around them, lying down with their heads on their paws, while others observed the desert that lay beyond them. During that period of time, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that conveys both relief and stress. When the rocks tumbled from the ravine, Daniel's thoughts went back to the moment when they had fallen. In the end, he asked Samir, "What are his plans for us if he comes across us once more?" The gaze of Samir was met. He will not give up. Men such as Arif are incapable of throwing in the towel. On the other hand, they are able to bleed. No matter how hot it was, Daniel was shivering. It wasn't that Samir said it in a nasty manner. Rather, it was that he stated it with absolute conviction. Because of an abrupt change in the lioness's position, both of their attention was immediately drawn to the horizon. As her ears pricked forward, a rumbling growl rumbled from her chest. Her ears stood on end. The remaining members of the pride began to tense their muscles and fix their gaze on a spot that was beyond the cliffs. Sitting in a crouching position near the edge of the overhang, Samir looked out. It was scarcely audible above a whisper when he spoke the word "riders." It caused Daniel's tummy to clench. "Arif?" Samir responded, "I am unable to see things clearly, but they are moving at a rapid pace." Although the riders were still a considerable distance away, their faces appeared to be swaying in the heat haze. Yet, it was clear that they were riding in the direction of the rocky maze specifically. Already slinging his rucksack over his shoulder, Samir stood up while carrying it. "We relocate right now." As the pride moved like shadows at their sides, they retreated into the labyrinth of stone and found themselves once again. In spite of the fact that the lioness' tail was brushing against him every few paces, Daniel kept his head down. There was an increase in the volume of the hoof sound, which was a rhythmic thud that carried into the hot air. Daniel felt his heartbeat speed. In his mind, he recalled the ravine, the gunfires, and the dust that was suffocating his lungs. The last thing he wanted to do was go through it again. Samir made a sudden left and descended a tight opening that was located between two enormous slabs of granite. After a twisting path, the path suddenly opened up into a big level stretch that was excessively open. At the same time as Samir did, Daniel came to the realization that they were exposed. After that, a voice that was icy and unmistakable seemed to reverberate across the stones. "Did you seriously believe that you could conceal yourself from me, old man?" "It is Arif." He was present here. This time he had a greater number of soldiers. Every step that Arif took on his black steed caused clouds of dust to be kicked up, and he galloped forward at the head of the group. From behind him, 6 riders dispersed themselves, each of them carrying a weapon either casually in their hands or slung across their backs. When the sun reflected off of the metal, Daniel felt a chill run down his stomach. The frame of Samir was stiff, but composed as he slowed down and planted himself between the motorcyclists and Daniel. A loose crescent was formed in front of the youngster by the lions as they instinctively stretched out in front of him. While their ears were lowered and their gaze were fixed on the impending danger, their tails flicked in unison. Arif brought the stallion around to within striking distance, and the animal tossed its head in response to the scent of potential predators. As he spoke, his voice carried readily through the calm air. "You've caused me more trouble than you're worth," he added. "But I'll give you a chance," she said. "Once you have the boy in your possession, I will allow you to leave." There was a low, resonant growl that came from the lioness. and it appeared as though it was vibrating through the stone. Daniel felt it in his bones, but rather than it filling him with fear, it filled him with a weird serenity that spoke defiance. The response that Samir gave was measured and nearly silent. "You will have to take him away from all of us if you want him," the speaker said. As Arif smiled, his eyes did not reach his mouth. "It is as it is." At the same time that he raised his hand, two riders dismounted and moved forward with caution. The lion's bodies stiffened up like springs that had been wound up. He was aware that a single mistake would set everything in motion, and his breath seized as he realized this. Unfortunately, the first rider came too close. When the largest male lion came at the man, its jaws snapped just a few inches away from his arm. Another rider attempted to make a turn to the side, while the first rider fell backwards and cursed. Samir shifted his position and positioned himself in their route, maintaining a balanced and prepared stance. Arif remained atop his horse and observed the event as if he were a man taking pleasure in a private show. It was he who yelled out, "You can't win, Samir. You are outnumbered, and sooner or later, the desert will finish what I started. I am completely outnumbered." Never once did Samir's eyes go away from the men in front of him. "Might be. I don't believe that you have as good of an understanding of these lions as you believe you have." In response to the stimulus, the pride moved, albeit not in a chaotic manner, but rather with precise coordination. During the time when the lioness was directing Daniel in the opposite direction toward a narrow crack in the rock, two males flanked the horsemen, preventing them from retiring. The gap was visible to Daniel as well, and Samir's gaze darted toward it. There wasn't much there, but it was a way out. Next, a new sound reverberated over the desert, and it was the distant thud of additional hooves. This sound came from behind Arif's troop. Everyone went completely still for a split second. Arif made a sudden turn in his saddle and started looking out over the horizon. His gaze moved in an uneasy manner. The lions did not move away from the sound, but their ears turned toward the direction of noise. Out in the distance, dust started to accumulate. Hard work was being put in by whoever was arriving. Daniel turned his attention to Samir, whose attitude had shifted so that it was no longer one of relief, but rather one of cautious expectancy. Whoever was on their way may fundamentally alter the course of events. As it reverberated off the stone walls, the thunderous sound of hooves became increasingly louder until it filled every nook and cranny of the open stretch. Daniel strained his eyes to see through the haze, attempting to pick out shapes despite the shimmering heat being present. At first, there were nothing more than shadows. However, it wasn't long until the silhouettes of riders appeared. There were 5 or possibly 6 of them, traveling in a close formation while dust was falling behind them, like a cloud of storm. Arif's steed moved beneath him, and his nostrils flared out in surprise. The new group was getting closer, and he raised his weapon but did not shoot it. His eyes narrowed as they got closer. He mumbled something under his breath, saying, "Who in hell?" When Samir stood still, his weight was evenly distributed, and he watched the riders with the patience of a man who was familiar with the ways of the desert. Although the lions did not move, their tails twitched, indicating that their muscles were contracted. Daniel experienced a very slight pressure from the lioness's shoulder against his thigh, which served as a silent reassurance. In the process of getting closer, the newcomers broke formation. The front of the group was dominated by a woman who was wearing a dark scarf that blew in the wind and had a towering and authoritative posture. The horse she was riding slowed down to a trot and then stopped a few paces away from Arif. In the direction of her, the remaining horsemen dispersed themselves, establishing a wall that prevented him from retreating. A woman's voice was so piercing that it could cut through the heat as she said the word Arif, still pursuing children, as far as I can tell. The smile that Arif wore was flimsy and alluring. "Get away of this situation, Layla. It's not your battle to win." In a one seamless motion, Layla dismounted, hearing the sound of her boots crunching into the sand. She looked past him toward Samir and the boy, her eyes lingering on the pride that was around them. "It became my fight the moment you crossed my land," she said. "In addition, you chose the wrong desert to play the role of a hunter." Arif's face was filled with a look of uncertainty for the very first time, which Daniel witnessed. His guys looked into each other's eyes with apprehension, their fists clenching their weapons. Samir's voice came in a low but consistent tone. "Arif, you are aware of how this turns out. Exit the room." In spite of this, Arif did not leave. There was an abrupt and very rapid movement of his hand toward his firearm. It was the male lion that was nearest to him that let out a roar that rocked the air and surged forward. The rider was nearly thrown off his horse as the stallion reared. Arif shot in a highly erratic manner, the bullet kicking up sand that was far away from its intended target. The chaos broke out. As Layla's riders pushed forward, they were able to close the deficit. Samir had trained his movements with such accuracy that he was able to disarm one of Arif's men before he could even shoot. The horses were driven back by the lions, who worked in perfect harmony with one another. This forced the attackers into tight pockets where they were unable to maneuver. When dust and shouting began to swirl about them, Daniel lowered himself to a low squat, and the lioness stood vigil over him. It was through the haze that he was able to get glimpses of Layla removing a weapon from the hands of a rider, Samir pushing another away from the youngster, and Arif attempting to urge his horse, which was in a state of terror, into the conflict. All of a sudden, just as abruptly as it had started, it was finished. A couple of Arif's men had escaped into the desert, their horses running away from them. The others were left unarmed and were being protected by Layla's riders. Arif himself sat rigidly in the saddle, his eyes darting between the lions and the guarded wall that was in front of him. He forced himself to breathe deeply. With a solemn tone, Layla moved closer to the object. "Come away, right now. Should I come across you once more, you will not receive a second warning." The jaw of Arif got constricted. At one point, Daniel entertained the idea of declining the offer. After that, however, he turned his horse around and rode away, leaving the other members of his crew to scramble after him. There was a gradual settling of silence over the desert. Although they relaxed their position, the lions continued to keep their gaze locked on the figures that were on the move. Samisha approached Daniel and knelt down so that they were at the same eye level. "It's over," he whispered in a low voice. Daniel was uncertain as to whether or not he believed it. For the first time in several days, he experienced a sense of security when the lioness was standing next to him, and her steady gaze met his. The only sounds that could be heard in the desert were the faint whistle of the wind and the gentle shifting of sand beneath paws and boots. The desert was once again calm. Although Daniel's heartbeat started to slow down, the strain that was building up in his chest did not immediately go away. The black shadow of Arif kept appearing on the horizon, and he kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting it to be there next time. As Layla approached, she did so while dusting a layer of dust off of her scarf. The moment she gazed down at the boy, her gaze became more gentle. Although she did not speak in a condescending manner, she did say, "You were lucky," yet her tone was respectful. Few people are able to escape Arif's grasp. Daniel took a throatful. It was then that his eyes flickered to the lioness that was standing at his side. She blinked slowly as if she agreed with him. "I didn't walk away alone." With a knowing smile, Samir gave a little smile. "It is not. You were surrounded by the proper kind of people." Layla took a time to examine the pride, her brows furrowing in concentration. "In spite of the fact that they are not tame, they protect you as if you were one of their own. It is unlike anything I have ever seen before." Even though neither of them had, Daniel did not feel the need to explain it to anyone. He was of the opinion that certain connections did not require comprehension. Rather, they merely required sensation. Getting back to a place of safety was a long and steady journey. As they made their way through the rocky maze and returned into the open dunes, Layla's riders created a protective ring around them. For a period of time, the lions followed them around, maintaining a safe distance, yet remaining visible at all times. Daniel observed that the lioness would approach him from a closer distance whenever he made a mistake, as if she was getting ready to seize him. As the afternoon progressed, the silhouette of a small desert outpost became visible against the horizon. It was comprised of a collection of canvas shelters and structures that had been whitewashed. In that place, the air had a subtle aroma of bread and tea that had been boiled, and Daniel found it to be the most delightful aroma he had ever experienced. Finally, the pride came to an end as they approached the settlement's boundary. The lioness took a step forward, lowering her enormous head until it was at the same level as Daniel's chest. Despite his reluctance, he extended his hand, and his fingers lightly touched the rough warmth of her fur. The only sounds that could be heard were the boy, the desert, and the steady rise and fall of her breath. For a brief while, the world was silent. "Thank you," he mumbled in a low voice. After making a single, careful blink, she turned around without making a sound and retreated into the sand dunes as she did so. After that, the remaining members of the pride followed, their golden forms vanishing into the brilliance of the setting sun until they were nothing more than shadows stretching off into the distance. Daniel was provided with food and water by Lila, who was located inside the outpost. While Samir sat with him on the low steps of a mud brick structure, the evening breeze helped to alleviate the heat that had been there throughout the day. Samir whispered, "The desert does not give back what it takes," and he was entirely correct. But on occasion, if you are extremely fortunate, it will provide you with something that is equally as valuable. Daniel reflected on the lioness, recalling her unblinking eyes and the manner in which she had shielded him from potential harm on multiple occasions. He was well aware that he would never be able to view her in the same manner that other people viewed lions. Throughout his life, he would consider her to be more than a wild animal. She demonstrated that compassion could still be found even in the most difficult of circumstances. As the sun began to set over the desert, Daniel lay down beneath a night sky that was filled with stars. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, he experienced the sensation of experiencing safety. The pride seemed to be moving through the sand in some part of the world, but the breeze was able to obliterate their tracks. He was aware of their presence in his memories, in his breast, and in the silent understanding that he owed his life to them. However, their presence continued to last. If you were moved by this story, please take a moment to think about the unanticipated connections that have the potential to alter our lives. Subscribing to this channel will provide you with further true stories of bravery, loyalty, and survival. Allow these tales to serve as a reminder that even in the most remote locations, kindness can still find its way.